He built an empire. She sold wildflowers on the street, and neither expected a single moment to change everything. Daisy Bailey is used to being overlooked. Her mornings begin before sunrise, arranging fresh flowers at a worn-down street cart, doing everything she can to keep her grandmother safe and fed. She's not chasing a dream, she's just trying to make it through the day. Robert Sage doesn't make detours. He's the sharp, composed CEO of Sage Corp, known for his vision, ruthlessness, and distance from anything resembling real life. But one rainy morning, a wrong turn brings him face to face with a girl who doesn't know his name, doesn't care about his money, and sells hope for a living. One impulsive purchase, a cart full of flowers, and a connection neither of them expected. As Robert quietly begins to help Daisy from behind the scenes, their lives grow tangled in ways both beautiful and complicated. But secrets can't stay buried forever, and Daisy must decide if she can trust the man who's always lived behind a mask. Some love stories don't begin with a spark, they begin with rain. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I love hearing from you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt romance, one life at a time. The rain had come in steady sheets before sunrise, a soft rhythm tapping against the city's concrete bones. On the corner of 7th and Green, beneath a weathered canvas awning, Daisy Bailey knelt beside her cart, fingers red from cold, arranging wildflowers with the delicate care of someone who understood how beauty could bloom in the harshest places. Tulips, baby's breath, wild roses picked fresh before dawn. Each bundle was wrapped in brown paper, tied with humble twine, and placed in old mason jars lined up like soldiers awaiting a better day. Her sign, chalked in a fading blush pink script, read, "Daisy's petals, fresh starts, fresh flowers." It wasn't just a cart. It was her livelihood, her rhythm, her hope. She was pinning down the last bouquet, daisies naturally, when the low, smooth hum of an engine sliced through the muffled morning. A black luxury car, sleek and out of place on this side of town, coasted to a stop at the curb. No splash, no rush, just deliberate quiet. She barely looked up until the door opened. He wasn't supposed to be here. Robert Sage hadn't walked a city block in years without a reason, let alone stopped at a flower stand. But a last-minute detour to avoid gridlock traffic had curved his driver's route into a less familiar part of downtown. And there she was, soaked sleeves, rain-kissed hair, standing amidst a riot of color like it belonged to her. She didn't notice him at first. That struck him too. She wasn't smiling to sell, she wasn't performing, she was simply working, present, entirely unaware that one of the most powerful CEOs in the country was standing 10 feet away, holding an umbrella and a question he hadn't planned to ask. He stepped closer. She looked up. Her eyes were steady, dark and clear, like she saw through noise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but unshaken. He glanced over the jars of petals, the tiny handwritten tags, the chilled grace in her expression. "I'll take all of them," he said. "All?" Her brow lifted. He nodded. "All the flowers." She hesitated. "Any particular reason?" Robert pulled a crisp wallet from his coat and laid a generous sum on the counter. "Let's call it a good investment." Before she could answer, he turned and walked back to the car. No introduction, no explanation. Just a quiet man with a city to run, and a girl who had somehow broken the routine of his world with nothing more than wildflowers in the rain. She didn't know his name, not yet. But she would. He hadn't meant to look back. The black car slid into traffic like it belonged to another dimension, one where nothing smelled like wet pavement or blooming petals. Robert Sage sat in the back seat, his expression unreadable, gaze fixed forward, but his mind unwilling to let go of the street corner he'd just left behind. The girl had no idea who he was. That was refreshing. People usually fell over themselves the moment they heard his name. Sage Corp's CEO, youngest tech mogul to build a multi-sector empire from scratch, featured on magazine covers and economic panels alike. But she hadn't even blinked. She just offered him daisies. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen lighting up with a dozen unread emails, a calendar stacked to the minute, messages from board members, department heads, analysts, all waiting on decisions. But for once, he didn't open any of them. Instead, he stared at the raindrops streaking across the window and thought about her hands, slightly pink from cold, moving gently around each bouquet like she was placing something sacred. No pitch, no desperation, just quiet pride in simple things. He didn't usually notice women. Not like that. Not in the middle of a workday, not while en route to a boardroom full of expectation. But something about her stayed. He wasn't sure if it was the calm in her eyes or the way she didn't ask for more than what he gave. Maybe it was how out of place she looked, like color in a black and white frame. A thought tugged at him. He opened his phone again, but this time, not to check a spreadsheet. Find out who owns the flower permit on the corner of 7th and Green, he messaged his assistant. He didn't need a reason. Not yet. But Robert Sage had made a career out of acting on instinct before logic caught up. And something told him this wasn't the end of it. The sky had stopped crying by late morning, but Daisy couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, like the rain had rinsed more than just the streets. Her cart stood empty, a rare sight. She'd sold out before 10. Correction, he had bought everything before 10. She still wasn't sure what had happened. One moment she was tying off a bouquet of white tulips, and the next some impeccably dressed stranger with storm gray eyes and a voice like expensive scotch was offering to buy the whole cart. No flirtation, no fuss, just all of it. And then he disappeared. No name, no business card, no smug smile, just a wad of bills and a flash of black umbrella fading into traffic. She glanced down at the money in her coat pocket again, still untouched. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried questions, not answers. Why all the flowers? Who was he? What kind of person dropped that much cash and didn't even ask for change? Agnes would tell her not to overthink it. Some things, her grandmother often said, are just small blessings in strange packaging. Still, something about him unsettled her. She didn't even know his name. Back home, the apartment smelled like lavender and rice. Agnes was wrapped in her favorite quilt, eyes soft with warmth when Daisy stepped in. All sold? Her grandmother asked, voice raspy but hopeful. All gone, Daisy nodded, placing the money on the table, and not the usual way. Agnes arched a brow. Daisy gave her the shortened version. Tall man, tailored coat, bought everything and vanished. Her grandmother smiled gently. Maybe he saw something in you. Daisy laughed, shaking her head. Or maybe he just didn't like standing in the rain. But even as she busied herself with lunch, even as Agnes drifted into a nap with soft breathing and a peaceful face, Daisy found herself drifting back to the stranger's voice. The way he'd said, let's call it a good investment, as if she was worth betting on. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself wonder, what if he wasn't a fluke? What if he was a beginning? He told himself it was nothing, a chance encounter, a rainy day, a transaction like any other. But when Robert Sage walked into his office the next morning and found the slim file waiting on his desk, he didn't hesitate to open it. Aged 6. Business name Daisy's Petals, registered vendor listed to a small rent-controlled apartment 3 miles from Sage Corp. Emergency contact, Agnes Bailey, guardian dependent. He stared at the name longer than necessary. Daisy. It suited her, simple, unassuming, and somehow unforgettable. There was a photo too, not professional, just a scanned ID, her eyes not quite smiling, hair pulled back, like she hadn't realized anyone would care what she looked like. But he cared. And that unsettled him more than he liked. Robert leaned back in his chair, tapping the file lightly against his palm. His schedule blinked on the screen to his right. Conference calls, investor briefings, 3 separate strategy meetings. He should have closed the folder. He should have moved on. Instead, he picked up his phone. Monica, he said when his assistant answered. Reach out to Indigo Floral Design. Let them know I'm recommending a new freelance designer. Her name is Daisy Bailey. A pause. Of course, Mr. Sage, will she be applying directly? She'll come in tomorrow. Give her a name to contact, someone warm. You're sending her into Indigo? Monica asked cautiously. That's high end. Robert glanced out the window. So is she. He ended the call before she could say more. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He never meddled like this, never intervened unless there was something measurable to gain. But this didn't feel like strategy. It felt like instinct. She had no idea he'd traced her name, no idea he was quietly shifting the road beneath her feet, but he'd seen something in her, something rare. She didn't ask for chances. She made the best of scraps. And Robert knew what it meant to come from that place. This wasn't pity. This was recognition. And maybe, just maybe, he was overdue for something unscripted. The indigo floral design building didn't look like a place where she belonged. It towered 3 stories high in polished white stone and glass, nestled between a boutique perfumery and an art gallery that smelled faintly of sandalwood and money. Its name, Indigo, was etched into the glass like it had always been there, like the whole street had never been touched by weather or worry. Daisy stood just outside the doors, clutching her canvas bag a little too tightly. Inside that bag, a few samples she'd made with the best blooms she could find from the early morning market. Not from her cart. These were hand-picked, bound with silk ribbon she'd saved for something important. She hadn't planned to be here. The phone call yesterday still played in her head. We received your name as a recommendation for an open design consultant slot. We'd like to meet you. No details. No hint of who had passed her name along. Only a contact name, Amara Quinn. Daisy had nearly said no, but Agnes had looked at her with tired but certain eyes and said, just go. Walk through one door and see where the hallway leads. So here she was, standing at the threshold. She took a breath and stepped inside. The lobby was cool and hushed, fragrant with orchids and eucalyptus. A receptionist with sleek hair and perfect posture greeted her with a polite smile, already expecting her. Miss Bailey? The woman asked. Daisy nodded, voice caught somewhere between nerves and disbelief. Yes, that's me. You can head up to the 3rd floor. Amara Quinn will meet you in suite 3C. As Daisy rode the elevator, her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. Neat skirt, white blouse, hair pinned with a single daisy. She didn't look like the other women she passed. Their heels clicked, her shoes were softened by wear. But she reminded herself, this is still flowers, still beauty. You know how to make something bloom from almost nothing. Suite 3C opened into a sunlit workspace filled with petals, patterns, and curated chaos. And at its heart stood Amara, a woman in linen slacks and gold earrings with eyes that missed nothing. You're early, Amara said not unkindly. That's a good sign. Daisy offered a small, steady smile. Thank you for seeing me. You come recommended, and Indigo doesn't ignore intuition. The interview didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like a conversation. Amara asked about composition, about favorite textures and unexpected pairings. Daisy spoke of color as emotion of bouquets that whispered instead of shouted. And when she unwrapped the samples, wild garden peonies, dusty miller, lilac, and one blushing ranunculus, Amara paused, fingers brushing the arrangement like she'd found a forgotten note in a familiar song. This, she said quietly, feels honest. Daisy exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Amara nodded once, decisive. We'll start you on trial, a few commissions. If it works out, we'll talk more. By the time Daisy stepped back onto the street, the city felt different. She was still her, still the girl from the street corner. But something had opened, and somewhere, though she didn't know it yet, a man in a high-rise office was watching a flower bloom in a place it was never expected to grow. She had never worked in silence this luxurious. The back studio at Indigo smelled of roses and cedar, soft music humming through hidden speakers. Natural light flooded the workspace in gentle golden waves, warming the marble counters and casting soft halos around jars of dried lavender, preserved moss, and imported blooms with names Daisy couldn't yet pronounce. This was her first day. Not a job, a trial. 3 commissions to complete by the end of the week, each with its own theme, its own client, its own pressure. She'd arrived early again. A few staff members nodded politely as they passed, their heels clicking over the floor with practiced grace. Daisy kept her head down and hands busy, already lost in the first arrangement. A modern romantics bouquet for a gallery launch. Minimalist, but poetic. Stark whites and pale lilacs, clean, sculptural. She laid out her tools like she did at her cart. Clippers, floral tape, water tubes. Only here, the scissors were silver and the tape matched the brand's custom color palette. The first stem she picked up was a calla lily, cool and proud. She whispered to it like she always did. Not words, just breath, intention, a small, steady kind of reverence. She worked slowly, adjusting for balance, for spacing, for weight. The arrangement wasn't just visual, it had to feel right. Like a heartbeat. Halfway through, Amara drifted by, eyes skimming the table without a word. But when she passed, she murmured just loud enough for Daisy to hear, "You work like someone who grew up with flowers, not around them." It wasn't quite a compliment, It was a recognition, and it sent a quiet thrill through Daisy's chest. By late afternoon, her first bouquet was boxed and labeled for pickup. She washed her hands in the corner sink, the scent of lemon balm clinging to her skin. Still not used to the space, still not certain how she fit in it, but also not shrinking. As she gathered her things, she caught sight of something new on the wall across the room, a framed photograph. She hadn't noticed it yesterday. It showed the company's earliest team, 5 people. One tall man in a dark suit stood just slightly apart, his face unreadable but unmistakable. Him. Her breath caught. The man from the rain. The man who bought every flower from her cart and vanished into the city. What was he doing in a picture at Indigo? Beneath the frame, in delicate print, Robert Sage, strategic development patron. Her mouth went dry. She looked around, pulse fluttering. No one else seemed surprised. No one else even glanced at the photo. Of course, he was part of this place. It was beautiful, efficient, understated, powerful. Like him. Had he been the one who sent her here? The realization wasn't loud. It was slow and disorienting, like remembering a dream only after waking. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But something told her this wasn't just about flowers anymore. The walk home felt longer than usual. The distance hadn't changed. She moved through the city like it was a painting she'd suddenly been drawn into. Every detail sharper, more significant. The hum of tires on wet pavement, a bakery's fading scent of cinnamon and butter. The weight of the tote bag on her shoulder, still carrying a spare spool of silk ribbon, and the lingering scent of freesia. But mostly, it was his name echoing in her thoughts. Robert Sage. She hadn't spoken it aloud, not even when she saw it beneath the photograph. Not even when she stood alone in the studio, staring at the man who had changed her week, maybe her life, with a single gesture beneath an umbrella. Who was he, really? She'd seen his photo in the paper once, she realized, months ago. An article on Sage Corp's donation to a green initiative. She hadn't connected the man in that glossy spread with the stranger who'd asked for tulips and didn't blink at paying for her entire cart. It hadn't felt corporate. It had felt personal. That was what made it harder to understand. Why her? She replayed every detail she could remember. The way he studied her flowers like they held secrets. The way his gaze met hers like she wasn't invisible. The way he hadn't lingered. Not for thanks. Not for attention. He had just walked away. But now she stood in a space he helped build, arranging blooms under lights he'd probably approved. It felt strange. Uneven. Like he'd handed her a key without saying what door it opened. Why not just tell me? She wondered aloud as she climbed the stairs to the apartment. Inside, Agnes sat in her chair by the window, sunlight caught in her silver hair. She turned, smile faint but proud. You look like someone who survived her first day. Daisy smiled softly, setting her bag down, and maybe found a ghost along the way. Her grandmother raised an eyebrow. What kind of ghost? The helpful kind. Mysterious, possibly in a very expensive suit. Agnes chuckled, a quiet wheeze of amusement. Now that's my favorite kind of haunting. They sat together for a while, drinking tea steeped with mint from a chipped ceramic pot. Outside, the sky turned pink and gold at the edges, as if the city itself had paused to catch its breath. Gran, Daisy said finally, fingers tracing the edge of her mug, have you ever had someone believe in you before you did? Agnes looked at her for a long moment, then reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Yes, and it's why I'm still here. That night, Daisy lay in bed with sleep, hovering but distant. She didn't know if Robert Sage would ever appear again. She didn't know why he'd given her this gift, or what, if anything, he expected in return. But she knew this. Tomorrow, she would walk back into Indigo. She would create something honest and bold, and she would do it not for him, but because someone finally made her believe she could. The update came in a single line. Daisy Bailey began her trial work at Indigo. First project submitted ahead of deadline. Noted by Amara Quinn as organic, thoughtful, unusually intuitive. Robert read the message twice, though once was enough. He sat alone in his penthouse study, lights low, the city glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a galaxy spun sideways. A glass of neat scotch rested on the table beside him, untouched. He should have felt satisfied. He had intervened, quietly, precisely, like any calculated move. But satisfaction wasn't what settled in his chest. Something far less familiar did. He leaned back in the leather chair, eyes scanning the skyline, tracing the outlines of buildings he'd once helped fund or save or reshape. The city had always bent to his will, its gears oiled by strategy and reputation. He knew how to make things move. Yet Daisy Bailey had moved without his push. She'd walked through the door, but brought her own light with her. That was the difference. She hadn't called, hadn't sent thanks, hadn't tried to leverage his name. He wasn't sure if she'd even connected the dots. And somehow, that only made her more fascinating. He thought back to that afternoon under the umbrella, her hands cradling flowers like they had breath. The way she'd smiled, not like someone grateful for a customer, but like someone still choosing to hope. He hadn't seen that in a long time. Maybe ever. A soft knock at the study door broke his thoughts. Monica stepped in, tablet in hand. "I'm finalizing your itinerary for the West Coast Investor Roundtables," she said, tapping the screen. "Anything you'd like added?" He hesitated. "Send a small arrangement to Indigo," he said finally. "To the staff. Nothing over the top. Neutral palette. Subtle. No name attached." Monica blinked, surprised. "Any particular reason?" "No," he replied smoothly. "Just acknowledgement." She nodded, scribbled something in her notes, and turned to leave. He watched the door close, then stood, walking toward the window. The streets below shimmered with movement. Taxis, bicycles, people brushing past each other without knowing whose story they just walked through. He wondered if Daisy felt it, too, the edge of something changing. He hadn't planned for any of this to linger, but now he wasn't so sure he could let it go. And Robert Sage, man of logic, of iron habits and clean exits, was beginning to understand what it meant to want something without a plan. By the second morning at Indigo, Daisy had learned two things. First, no one cared what shoes you wore, if your work spoke louder than your wardrobe. Second, Amara Quinn was not one to hand out compliments, but when she nodded once in approval, it felt like being knighted. Daisy had completed her first bouquet ahead of schedule. It had been boxed and sent to a client with a name she didn't recognize and a reputation she was too afraid to Google. Now came the second, a custom piece for an upscale hotel reopening. The design brief was vague, which somehow made it harder. Warm elegance, old-world charm with modern restraint. Make it unforgettable. She stood in the studio staring at the shelves of flowers, trying to imagine what unforgettable even looked like. The other designers moved with purpose, confident, experienced, precise. And there she was, plucking stems like secrets, doubting every choice, until her fingers brushed a cluster of apricot garden roses, still curled in sleep. Their scent was soft, sunlight, and memory. Yes, that was her beginning. From there, she let instinct guide her. Silver brunia for texture, antique hydrangeas in dusky mauve, tall wisps of lisianthus that danced like candle flames. She added sprigs of preserved sage, just barely fragrant, a touch of something grounding. As the bouquet took shape, she lost track of time. The arrangement told a story, and she was following it like a thread through a darkened room. "Did you train formally?" The voice came from behind her, low and direct. Daisy turned, startled. A woman stood there, mid-40s, striking, composed. Cashmere shawl, perfect posture. She held a tablet in one hand and an air of influence in the other. "No," Daisy said quietly. "I grew up around flowers, selling them, making things, for people who couldn't afford big bouquets but still wanted something beautiful." The woman studied her for a long beat. "I'm Natalie Voss," she said. "Creative director for the hotel project. Amara asked me to take a look." Daisy's heart thudded. Of course. Natalie stepped closer, scanning the arrangement, then circling it once. Her fingers brushed the velvet petals of the roses, lifted a stem of eucalyptus. "It's bolder than expected," she said, "but it doesn't try too hard. That's rare." Daisy blinked. "Thank you." Natalie nodded once. "We'll use this version. Don't change a thing." As quickly as she'd arrived, she disappeared through the studio doors, her heels echoing against the polished floor. Daisy stood still, surrounded by flowers and the scent of something larger than herself taking root. She'd just impressed someone important, and not by trying to imitate the others, but by creating what felt right. Later that afternoon, a delivery arrived, an elegant, understated bouquet for the team. Pale hellebores, soft anemones, ranunculus the color of almond cream. No note. No sender. Amara glanced at it, barely lifting a brow. "From upstairs," she murmured. Daisy didn't ask what that meant, but her heart fluttered anyway. Somewhere above her, in boardrooms or glass offices or silent corners, someone was watching. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of being seen. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and champagne, an orchestra of elegance, choreographed down to the last thread of linen and click of cufflinks. Robert stood near the far end of the room, glass in hand, a practiced smile in place. He wasn't here for the speeches or the headlines. He rarely was. But Indigo's hotel launch was one of his quieter investments. Strategic, yes, but now unexpectedly personal. Because Daisy's design stood at the center of it all. He'd recognize it the moment he walked in, not by signature, but by essence. The roses, the sage, the restraint, the truth in it. It looked like her hands, her eyes, her voice, curious and gentle and bold all at once. He hadn't planned on attending. He'd told himself distance was wiser, that he'd done enough, opened a door, planted a seed. But tonight he wanted to see, not interfere, just witness. He watched as guests moved past the centerpiece, pausing to admire it. Photographers circled. A woman with a PR badge whispered, "Floral by Indigo." That new assistant, I think, Daisy something? The name stirred something in him, a pull he hadn't yet named. He was scanning the room almost involuntarily when he saw her. Across the floor, near a table set with vanilla thyme cocktails, Daisy stood beside Amara, modestly dressed in black, her hair pulled back in a low twist. There was a trace of nervousness in her posture, but her smile when someone complimented the arrangement was real, proud but not boastful. She didn't know he was there. And yet, something in him hoped she might look up, catch his eyes, wonder why he'd come. Instead, Robert stayed in the shadows, the invisible patron again. Watching her navigate a world he lived in but never truly felt at home in. He took a sip of his drink and turned away as a man approached her, young, confident, chatty. Robert didn't hear what was said, but Daisy's polite laugh reached him even from across the room. A strange tension tugged at him. He had no claim to her, no right to feel the flicker of something that felt territorial. But this wasn't just interest anymore. It was curiosity laced with admiration. It was investment that had turned emotional. It was the subtle ache of wanting to know who she was when she wasn't holding back. He had built empires, acquired companies, won negotiations with silence alone. But Daisy Bailey, she was not a deal to be closed. She was something delicate and wildly unscripted. And for once in his Robert Sage wasn't sure how this story would end. The gala sparkled around her like a dream she hadn't meant to wander into. She'd followed Amara's gentle push to attend, armed with a borrowed clutch and the nerves of someone who hadn't worn heels in 3 years. The hotel lobby had been transformed, pillars wrapped in ivy, gold-lit vases lining the room, and right at the center, her arrangement. Guests paused in front of it like it was art. Some took pictures. One woman called it hauntingly elegant. Daisy stood near the periphery, clinging to a glass of sparkling water. She didn't know where to place herself in a room like this. She didn't belong to this world of tuxedos and whispered deals until a voice met her ear. Low, smooth, unmistakable. You brought the room to stillness. She turned, startled, and there he was. Robert Sage, in a tailored black suit, the kind of clean-shaven, composed presence that made her feel like the world had suddenly slowed. Up close, he didn't look as untouchable as she remembered. There was tension in his shoulders, a quiet wariness in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to speaking without some shield in place. "Mr. Sage," she managed, the words barely clearing her throat. "You're here." His gaze held hers. "You didn't expect me." "No," she admitted. "I thought you preferred umbrellas and anonymity." His smile was small, but real. "I don't usually attend openings," he said, "but I had to see what you made." She looked down, flushed. "It's just flowers." "It's not," he said simply. "It's you. Honest, specific, beautiful." The compliment landed gently but firmly. Daisy didn't know what to say, so she didn't. She let the silence fill the space between them, charged and fragile. Finally, she asked, "Why me?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "You reminded me," he said slowly, "of something I'd forgotten, what it's like to create something that matters without calculating who it's for." She studied him. "Is that how you live? Calculated?" Robert didn't flinch. "Until recently, yes." Daisy tilted her head. "And now?" His voice dropped a fraction, quieter than before. "Now I'm not so sure." Another silence, but this time it hummed with understanding. "I should probably get back to my corner," she said softly, gesturing to where Amara was chatting with a few stylists. where the real florists stand. He stepped aside, but not before meeting her eyes again. "You're not in the corner, Daisy," he said. "Not anymore." She walked away before her legs could betray her. She didn't turn to see if he watched her go. That night, long after the lights dimmed and the borrowed heels were tucked under her bed, Daisy sat at her small kitchen table, barefoot and wide awake. She replayed every word, every glance, every breath in that conversation. She had no idea what this meant, why Robert Sage, of all people, had noticed her. Not just her flowers. Her. But she knew this. She'd never forget the way he said her name. Like it wasn't small, like it belonged in rooms like that. And somehow, so did she. The gala had ended hours ago, but the night lingered. Robert sat on the terrace of his penthouse, shirt sleeves rolled, tie loosened, and a half-empty tumbler of scotch forgotten beside him. Below, the city murmured its midnight rhythm. Distant horns, blinking lights, the endless breath of ambition. But his mind was somewhere else, with her, Daisy Bailey. She hadn't shrunk in that ballroom. She hadn't tried to impress. She'd stood quietly near the back, as if waiting for permission to believe she belonged, while everyone else looked at her creation like it had been born from a museum, not a street cart. And then she'd spoken to him, not nervously, not flatteringly, not like someone who wanted something, just honestly. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he had told her. It hadn't been planned. He wasn't in the habit of revealing things. But there'd been something in the way she tilted her head, as if she saw past the name, past the power, past the layers he so carefully wrapped himself in. She saw the man underneath. And it unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. Robert stood and walked back into the study, the dim lamplight brushing against framed articles and blueprints, empires he'd helped build. He had everything he was supposed to want, but none of it had ever looked at him the way she had. Not with awe, not with ambition, but with curiosity. "Why me?" she'd ask. He'd told the truth, because she created with no angle, no agenda. Her work wasn't loud, but it stayed with you, just like she did. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the contact labeled Amara Quinn. His finger hovered over the message icon. No, too soon, too obvious. He tossed the phone onto the leather couch, irritated at himself. This wasn't him. He didn't chase. He didn't linger. But tonight, he was lingering, and the idea of not seeing her again, of simply vanishing back into silence, felt suddenly unbearable. He poured the rest of the scotch down the sink, then stood for a long moment, watching the skyline. Maybe she didn't know yet, but he wasn't finished. Not with her. Not with the way she made the world feel a little less gray. And Robert Sage had never walked away from something that stirred him this deeply. Monday mornings at Indigo were usually quiet. Coffee cups half full, soft jazz playing through overhead speakers, the scent of fresh stock waiting to be unboxed. But today, as Daisy stepped into the studio, something felt different. The air held the soft hush of expectation, as if the walls remembered last night. Her arrangements still sat near the back of the showroom, touched up slightly, placed behind a glass panel now, like it had graduated into something worthy of reverence. She barely had time to settle her tote bag before Amara approached, clipboard in hand and a rare softness in her eyes. "You made an impression," she said without preamble. Daisy blinked. "At the gala?" "Everywhere," Amara replied. "Natalie Voss wants you to lead the next installation at the secondary hotel site. Solo." Daisy's stomach dropped, then fluttered. "Solo?" Amara gave her a look. "Don't act surprised. You earned this." Daisy managed a nod, unsure whether to laugh or faint. She barely slept last night. Robert's words had haunted her dreams like perfume clinging to silk. Now this. "Also," Amara added, more casually, "Mr. Sage called this morning. Left no details. Just said he'd be stopping by sometime this week." Daisy froze. "Here?" Amara arched a brow. "Unless you know of another indigo flowers." Her heart stammered. Why would he come here? What would she say? Was it business, courtesy, or something else entirely? As the day unfolded, Daisy threw herself into prep work. She trimmed stems, reviewed client briefs, tried to ignore the weight of expectation quietly pressing on her spine. But her hands trembled once when she reached for a cluster of Dusty Miller, the same muted silver green she'd used in the gala bouquet. Her mind wandered. The quiet moment with him, his voice in her ear, that stillness between them, thick with unsaid things. And then, sometime just after 2 o'clock, The bell above the studio door rang. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She felt him. That pause in the air, that hush in the room, like even the flowers were paying attention. Daisy straightened her posture and slowly turned. Robert stood there, coat open, no tie today, just a slate gray button-up rolled at the sleeves and a look in his eyes that said, this wasn't business. Not entirely. Hi, he said. Simple. Unassuming. But her pulse leapt anyway. Hi, she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You found us. He stepped closer, slowly, respectfully, as if every inch between them mattered. I told you I'd see what you made, he said, gesturing to the arrangement behind her. But I realized I never told you what it made me feel. Daisy swallowed. I was going to send a note, he added, but it didn't seem enough. So, she asked, voice steadier than she felt, what did it make you feel? Robert studied her for a long moment, and then, like I was standing in front of something alive, not just beautiful, real. Her breath caught, her fingers curled against the counter's edge, and for the first time, Daisy didn't feel like a flower girl in someone else's world. She felt like the center of the story. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The soft hum of the jazz station, the muted scent of Frisia, and even the distant rhythm of the city faded into a quiet backdrop. All she could feel was the weight of Robert's gaze, and the way it made her want to both hold her ground and look away. That's kind of you to say, Daisy murmured, though the words felt too small for what she wanted to express. Robert's lips quirked, just slightly. Kindness wasn't the goal. Honesty was. She let out a soft laugh, nervously tucking her hands into the pockets of her apron. Honesty's not something I'm used to hearing in this world. Usually, it's more about strategy. His smile deepened, and there was something rueful in it. Then I should warn you, I'm terrible at small talk. Well, she said, finding her voice again, I'm not exactly fluent in gala speak either, so maybe we're even. Robert tilted his head, watching her in that disarming way that made her feel both completely seen and utterly unsure of herself. You know, you're different. Different how? She asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. He hesitated, his eyes drifting to the arrangement behind her, the one that had started this unexpected connection. You don't perform, he said finally. You don't posture. You don't act like you have to prove something. And yet... She waited, holding her breath. And yet you remind me what it means to create, he said softly. To be real. Her heart stuttered. She wasn't sure how to respond, how to hold the weight of those words. They weren't compliments exactly. They were something deeper, something closer to truth. Mr. Sage, she began, but he interrupted her gently. Robert, he said. Please. Robert, she corrected, awkwardly. Why are you here? Really? The question hung in the air between them, fragile but unyielding. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he stepped back, hands sliding into his pockets. To remind you, he said, his voice quieter now, that the world you think you don't belong in is already yours. You don't need anyone's permission to stand in it. And with that, he turned toward the door. Wait, Daisy blurted out before she could think better of it. He paused, half turning, his eyebrows raised slightly. She faltered, then cleared her throat. Thank you, for everything. I mean it. His smile this time was softer. Almost. Private. You're welcome, Daisy, he said. But don't thank me too much. I'm not sure I'm done yet. As he stepped out, leaving behind the faint trace of his cologne and the echo of his words. Later that evening, Daisy sat cross-legged on her bed, her notebook open in front of her. She hadn't written in it for years, not since her teenage dreams of designing for magazines had been boxed away alongside faded ambitions. But tonight, her hand moved almost on its own, sketching wild blossoms and twisting vines, shapes she hadn't dared imagine before. She paused, her pencil hovering. You don't need anyone's permission to stand in it. His voice rang clear in her mind. For once, she didn't argue with it, didn't shrink from it. Instead, she turned the page and started sketching again. This time, with no boundaries. He hadn't meant to say so much. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple. Drop in. Congratulate her. Maybe leave a note with a well-placed compliment. Keep things clean, professional, but standing in watching Daisy in her element. Robert knew clean lines didn't apply anymore. The way she looked at him, it wasn't with awe or intimidation or expectation. It was with something far more disarming. Curiosity. Like she was trying to make sense of who he really was, beneath the polished name and curated suits. That kind of gaze could unravel a man. He didn't go back to the office after leaving her shop. Instead, he drove, nowhere in particular. Past the neighborhoods he used to walk as a college intern, past the first building he'd ever acquired, past reminders of every version of himself he'd had to become just to get here. And still, none of it compared to the quiet intensity of standing in a flower shop with Daisy Bailey. He pulled up to the edge of Riverside Park and sat for a while, windows down, spring air curling into the leather interior. What was this? She wasn't the first woman to challenge his focus, but this wasn't distraction. This was directional. Something about her reminded him of the man he'd been before the stakes got so high, before boardrooms and acquisition talks and the ceaseless pulse of power dulled the things that used to move him. He thought about her hands, ink-stained from sketching, fingertips dusted with pollen. He thought about the bouquet she made for the gala, the layers of meaning hidden in the blooms. It hadn't been just an arrangement. It had been a message. And he got it. A buzz from the passenger seat pulled him out of his thoughts. His phone. A text from Vivian, his COO. Board dinner next week, confirmed. Also, you missed the Voss call. Everything okay? He hesitated, then typed back. Reschedule with Voss, I'll handle it personally. A pause. Then, you're going to the site again, aren't you? Robert didn't answer right away. Then, something's changing. I need to see it through. He placed the phone down again and stared out over the water. There were deals to close, papers to sign, teams waiting on direction. But none of it mattered right now. Not compared to the woman who'd taken his breath away with blossoms. Not compared to the truth that Daisy Bailey had unknowingly cracked open something in him. Something he wasn't quite ready to put away. The floor at Indigo Design gleamed beneath her shoes as she walked slowly through the morning stillness, before the calls, before the emails, before the boutique opened its frosted glass doors to the city's most particular clientele. This was her favorite time of day. Silence and soft light. She moved through the studio, past glass vases that shimmered like sculpture, past floral installations suspended from gilded fixtures. It wasn't just a boutique, it was a gallery. A place where nature was curated, reimagined, and elevated, and somehow she was part of it now. She paused near the work table where she'd assembled the gala centerpiece just days before. A few stray petals remained in the corner, nearly swept away, but not quite. Like echoes, like proof. She brushed one of them into her palm, soft, pink, almost weightless, but it carried the memory of something much heavier, a moment she didn't think she'd ever have. And she had made it. Daisy had expected the imposter syndrome to creep in by now. For someone to tap her shoulder and tell her she'd overstepped, that the girl from the flower cart didn't belong in a place like this. But something had shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet certainty. She remembered the way Robert had looked at her. Not just admiration, but belief. It had stirred something already growing inside her, and for the first time, she didn't shrink beneath the attention. She stood a little straighter now when Amara walked by. She offered her ideas in meetings instead of rehearsing them in silence, and today, for the first time, she would meet with a client. Alone. Daisy stepped into the consultation room, where the morning sun angled through a set of sleek, slatted blinds, cutting sharp lines across the marble table. She spread out her sketchbook, samples of silk ribbons, and a carefully arranged palette of peonies, ranunculus, and delicate trailing jasmine. It wasn't just pretty. It was intentional, every bloom chosen not just for how it looked, but for what it meant. Her phone buzzed, a message from her grandmother. "You were made for this. Love you, my flower girl." Daisy smiled and held the phone to her chest for a moment, not because she needed the reassurance, but because it reminded her where she came from, and how far she'd already bloomed. The door opened behind her, and the client stepped in, a young woman in a tailored blush blazer with a tentative look in her eyes. "You must be Daisy," she said. "I am," Daisy replied, extending her hand. Her voice didn't shake. The woman smiled. "I heard your work at the gala was unforgettable." Daisy's lips curved. "Thank you. Let's create something unforgettable for you too." And just like that, she began. Rooted. Steady. The concept had started as a whisper, a sketch in the margin of her notebook, a color palette pulled from memories rather than mood boards. Sunlight through a linen curtain, the blush of flushed cheeks, the soft green of hope before it blooms. Now, it was a full proposal, her first. Daisy stood at the head of the consultation room, portfolio open before her, presenting to her client, Natalie Chase, founder of a boutique PR firm that was celebrating its 10-year anniversary with a rooftop soiree. Natalie was graceful, confident, and surprisingly gentle in her feedback. "I've seen 10 versions of peonies and crystal vases," she said, flipping through Daisy's hand-drawn designs, "but this feels alive, personal." Daisy exhaled, relief unfurling in her chest like the petals of her chosen centerpiece bloom. "That's what I was hoping for," Natalie smiled. "You're not what I expected when Amara said I'd be working with someone new." "I'm getting that a lot lately," Daisy said with a soft laugh. Natalie paused, tracing a fingertip over the page. "You've captured something really special. This arrangement, it reminds me of the garden my mother kept. She passed a few years ago. You couldn't have known." Daisy swallowed gently. "Maybe some things find their way into the work when we lead with our heart." There was a long, quiet moment. Then Natalie nodded. "I want you to do the full event. Centerpieces, entrance archway, even the hanging florals. I trust your eye." Daisy blinked. "All of it?" "Every bloom." She tried to stay professional, smiling, offering a calm thank you, but inside her heart was doing cartwheels. It wasn't just approval, it was trust. As the meeting wrapped, Natalie mentioned casually, "Oh, one more thing. I've invited some friends from the investor side of the industry. One of them is actually my firm's early backer. He doesn't usually show for these things, but he RSVP'd yes this time." Daisy nodded, flipping her planner closed. "May I ask who?" Natalie smiled, breezing toward the door. "Robert Sage." Daisy's pen slipped from her hand. Of course, the universe had impeccable timing. The week of the event arrived quickly. Daisy had spent hours sourcing specific seasonal flowers, each one approved by Natalie, each arrangement tailored with intention. She coordinated the team, oversaw delivery windows, and even had custom ceramic vessels made by a local artisan. But the night before the event, as she stood on the rooftop checking the final placement of the floral installations, it wasn't the pressure she felt most, it was anticipation. She wasn't just stepping into her role, she was stepping into her story. The night of the soiree. The lights twinkled across the skyline as soft music filtered through the rooftop. Guests in sleek suits and flowing dresses wandered between candlelit tables and curated floral centerpieces. Daisy stood near the back, dressed simply but elegantly, clipboard in hand, quietly observing. She hadn't expected to stay, but Natalie had insisted. "You created the experience," she'd said. "You deserve to watch it bloom." And then she saw him. Robert. Tall, tailored, timeless. Moving through the crowd with his usual quiet gravity. Her breath caught. She didn't even realize she was holding it until he turned, and their eyes met. He excused himself from a group and walked toward her, weaving through guests like he had all the time in the world. When he reached her, he looked at the centerpiece beside them, then back at her. "I should have known this was your work," he said, voice low. "It's beautiful." Daisy found her voice, even if it trembled a little. "Thank you. It's my first full commission." His gaze warmed. "And already unforgettable." She laughed softly. "You have to stop saying things like that. I'll start believing you." Robert's expression turned thoughtful. "That's the idea, Daisy." A moment passed, charged, unspoken. Then someone called his name from the terrace, and he glanced in that direction before returning his eyes to her. "Later?" he asked. Daisy didn't hesitate. "Yes, later." And as he walked away, she didn't feel small or out of place. She felt like she belonged, like maybe this was just the beginning. He should have been mingling. These nights were built for it. Handshakes, polite laughters, long glasses of aged whiskey passed around like currency. Most people in the room were part of that ever-turning wheel. Strategic partnerships, whispered deals, the usual. But Robert wasn't in the mood for usual. Not tonight. Not after seeing her again. From the moment Daisy's eyes met his across the rooftop, the rest of the evening began to blur. He remembered the conversation that followed, barely. Investors, compliments about his latest acquisitions, some eager 20-something asking for a mentorship coffee he'd never commit to. But all of it was static compared to the clarity he felt watching her work. Daisy wasn't just present at the event. She was woven into it, Each floral arrangement whispered her name, delicate and bold, balanced and brave, like her. Robert leaned against the balcony railing now, away from the buzz, sipping a drink he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. From here, he could see her inside the venue, speaking with the lighting team. She gestured toward one of the hanging installations and smiled as they adjusted it slightly, just the way she'd envisioned. There was nothing accidental about her presence here. She wasn't lucky. She was earned. And it hit him, all at once, how rare that was. How rare she was. He wasn't used to being on the outside looking in. But tonight, he didn't mind. Tonight, he wanted to witness her shine. Just then, someone joined him on the terrace. Natalie's new find, said a voice behind him. James Voss, one of his oldest business contacts. He nodded toward Daisy inside. She's got quite the touch. Robert didn't answer immediately. Voss chuckled. You're quiet. That's either a bad sign or a very good one. Robert set his glass down. It's a sign I'm thinking. She yours? Voss asked, raising a brow. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. She's her own. Voss gave a low whistle. So it's like that. Robert turned to face him. It's nothing like anything. And that was the truth. He wasn't sure what to call this yet. Admiration, curiosity, attraction, they were all part of it. But it was more than a spark. It was the weight of potential. Something real. Voss gave a nod, half respectful, half amused. Well, for what it's worth, she made this place look like a dream. If she's building a name, you'd be smart to back her early. Robert's jaw flexed. I'm not thinking like an investor tonight. Voss laughed and wandered back inside. Robert stayed at the railing a little longer, watching as Daisy moved through her final checks, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of quiet pride. She hadn't seen him again since earlier. But he wasn't in a rush. Some things deserved patience. He straightened his tie, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and stepped back into the warm hum of the room. The night wasn't over yet, and neither, he was beginning to realize, was this story. The city was slow to wake that morning, its usual tempo, brisk footsteps, car horns, the metallic clatter of urban urgency, was softened by the hush of Sunday. But inside Daisy's apartment, everything pulsed with a quiet energy she couldn't name. She sat at her small table by the window, a chipped ceramic mug warming her hands. The tea had long gone cold, but she hadn't moved. Not yet. She was still unwinding the night in her mind, the glow of fairy lights against blooms she'd placed with her own two hands, the buzz of conversation under a canopy she designed, Natalie's proud smile, 100 tiny wordless validations, and then Robert. The way he'd said her name like it was something rare. The way his eyes had held hers, steady and certain, like she was someone he'd been waiting to see step into the light. She hadn't expected to see him again at the event. She hadn't expected the way it made her feel when she did. And maybe the strangest part wasn't the nerves or the flutter of something dangerously close to hope. It was the calm that followed. A quiet voice inside her that whispered, yes, this is yours. Not him. Not yet. Maybe never. But the moment, the feeling. The becoming. Her phone buzzed. She blinked, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. She let it ring once more, twice, then answered. Hello. A polished voice came through. Good morning, is this Daisy Bailey? This is she. This is Mariana Devereux, assistant to Mr. Robert Sage. He asked me to reach out directly. Daisy sat up straighter. Oh, yes, of course. Mariana's tone was warm, efficient. Mr. Sage was impressed with your work last night and asked if you'd be open to discussing a private design commission. It's a personal project, quite exclusive. He'd prefer to speak with you in person if you're available. Daisy's heart skipped. Did he say, what kind of project? He mentioned it's time-sensitive, Mariana replied. He'll explain more when you meet. Would tomorrow morning be too soon? Tomorrow. So soon. She looked down at her hands, the same ones that had once bundled wildflowers for tourists, the same ones that had tied silk ribbons in winter wind, arranged peonies in a borrowed bucket, scribbled dreams in the margins of her sketchbook. Tomorrow works, she said. Excellent. He'll meet you at 9 a.m., Sage Tower, 30th floor. After the call ended, Daisy set the phone down slowly, the quiet of her apartment expanding again around her. The city outside yawned to life. And she smiled. Whatever was waiting at the top of that tower, she would meet it with both feet planted, hands steady, heart open, because she wasn't just building a career. She was building a life. She had never set foot in a building like Sage Tower before. It rose above the city like something carved from ambition itself. Glass and steel and reputation stacked neatly into the clouds. At the 30th floor, Daisy stepped out of the elevator and into a world so quiet, so polished, it made her feel like even her breath needed permission to exist there. The receptionist greeted her warmly and offered tea while she waited. Everything, from the subtle floral arrangement on the marble desk to the ambient music that barely touched the air, felt curated, just like him. She smoothed the hem of her blouse and focused on the steady rhythm of her breath. "You belong in the room." That was what Amara had told her the night before when Daisy confessed she'd been invited to meet Robert. "Don't shrink. Just speak. You've earned this." The door to the inner office opened, and there he was, Robert Sage. He didn't wear power the way most men in his position did, not as armor or currency. On him, it was quiet, thoughtful, an undercurrent rather than a performance. He wore a slate gray suit today, no tie, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest he wasn't here to intimidate her. "Daisy," he said with a small smile. "Right on time." "I try," she replied, voice steady. "Thank you for inviting me." He motioned toward a seat in his office, a minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that humbled the skyline. A low arrangement of white orchids sat between them. "You were extraordinary the other night," he said as he sat. "I wasn't the only one who noticed, but I wanted the first offer." She tilted her head. "Offer?" Robert nodded. "A design commission. Personal. Something more private than the rooftop soiree. It's delicate." Daisy waited, letting him find his words. He folded his hands on the table. "My sister is getting married in 6 weeks. Small ceremony, mostly family. She's always wanted something different, not showy, something alive and meaningful. She asked me to help find someone." Daisy blinked. "And you thought of me?" "I couldn't think of anyone else." Her heart tugged, a little too fast. "I'll be honest," he continued. "I wasn't sure she'd go for a boutique designer without a long list of celebrity clients. But when I showed her photos of your work from the event, she didn't even hesitate." Daisy breathed in, letting the moment settle. "What would you need from me?" "A design proposal by next week. She's flying in to finalize details. You'd meet her, walk the space, collaborate directly. Compensation is generous and yours to set, but more than that, Daisy," his eyes met hers, "this is one of those projects that doesn't just elevate your career, it defines it." She felt a quiet quake in her chest. There it was again, that whisper of becoming. Daisy straightened her shoulders. "Then I'd be honored." A slow smile formed on his lips. "Good." There was a beat, and then he added, "There's something else. I'll be stepping back while you and my sister collaborate. But I'd like to stay close to the process." She raised a brow. "As the helpful big brother?" He smiled again. "Let's say an interested observer." Heat crept into her cheeks. "I'll try not to disappoint either of you." "You couldn't if you tried." The way he said it, low, sure, like fact rather than compliment, made something stir inside her she didn't dare name. He stood and extended a hand. She took it, steady and sure. And as they shook, she realized something. This wasn't a step toward a dream. This was a door, and she had just walked through it. The door clicked shut with the gentlest finality. For a long moment, Robert didn't move. He stood at the center of his office, hands still faintly tingling from where hers had rested in his. The space felt different now. Not quieter, just emptier. Like the echo of her presence was still blooming through the air. He turned toward the window, gaze falling on the city's sharp edges and blurred motion. He had expected professionalism. He had even anticipated artistry. But he hadn't expected her calm, the way she sat across from him, composed yet open, unflinching in the face of a project that could change the entire trajectory of her work. There was nothing performative about her. She hadn't dropped industry buzzwords or fished for flattery. She listened. She saw. And in a world where everyone seemed intent on proving their worth with noise, Daisy Bailey moved with quiet purpose. He admired it more than he knew how to say. Robert reached for the folder on his desk, a thin portfolio with sample photos from the rooftop event. Her handwriting was on one of the notes. "Adjust color balance. Sunset will deepen palette." He smiled faintly. Details like that, they couldn't be taught. He returned the folder to the drawer and leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This wasn't part of the plan. Not that he had plans for her. He wasn't some careless executive mistaking admiration for infatuation. He respected her too much for that. But something about her presence had rearranged his thoughts, not derailed them, just realigned them. She reminded him that beauty didn't have to be bought in bulk or sold in strategy decks. It could be grown, shaped, quietly offered, and somehow she'd become the calm center in the chaos of his schedule. A stillness he hadn't known he was searching for. His phone buzzed, a calendar alert, back-to-back meetings through the rest of the afternoon, calls, contracts, demands. But before he dove in, Robert allowed himself one more moment, one final glance at the chair she'd sat in, her voice still soft in his memory. Then I'd be honored. So was he, though he hadn't said it. Not yet. The venue was a private estate tucked just beyond the city limits, secluded, sun-drenched, and sprawling with old charm. Olive trees framed a stone path that led to a modest glass conservatory, where light danced across the floor like something out of a dream. Daisy had seen photos, but nothing compared to standing there in person. She paused just outside the conservatory, sketchpad tucked under one arm, trying to quiet the drumbeat of nerves in her chest. This isn't a test, she told herself. It's a beginning. The door opened before she could knock. Daisy? Came a melodic voice. I'm Celia, Robert's sister. The woman standing in the doorway was radiant, but not in the way Daisy expected. She wasn't swathed in couture or dripping in careful poise. Celia wore a linen dress, hair loosely pinned, eyes bright with something warm and curious. I'm so happy to meet you, Celia said, pulling her into a light embrace that immediately settled Daisy's nerves. I've been looking forward to this. Me too, Daisy replied honestly. They stepped inside, and Daisy took a moment to absorb the space. Glass walls opened to a view of the garden. Natural light poured over weathered wood beams and stone floors. It wasn't opulent. It was honest and beautiful. This place means a lot to me, Celia said, walking beside her. It's where our mother used to keep her garden journals. We spent summers here, barefoot, playing with petals and chalk. It's lovely, Daisy said. It feels peaceful. That's what I want. Nothing big or extravagant, just intentional, alive. Daisy opened her sketchpad, revealing a page she'd started on the train. I took a few liberties, she said. I imagined floral canopies above the dining area, soft blush roses with pale eucalyptus, and draped silk runners with pressed wildflowers along the center of the tables. Celia leaned in, eyes wide with quiet delight. Oh, wow. You really see it. Daisy smiled. I don't want to outshine the setting. I want it to breathe. There was a beat of thoughtful silence. I knew Robert would find the right person, Celia said. He's protective, you know. Doesn't always say what he's thinking, but if he brought you in, it means he sees something. Daisy looked up, blinking. I wasn't sure he'd even remember me from the flower stand. Oh, he remembers, Celia said with a knowing grin. He doesn't talk about many people, but your name's come up more than once. Warmth flushed through Daisy's chest. They walked the grounds together for nearly an hour, measuring, noting sun angles, talking about floral symbolism, and laughing more than Daisy expected. By the time she left the estate, her notebook was full. Her head was buzzing with ideas, and her heart carried the faint echo of something new. Maybe she did belong in this world after all. The notification blinked across his phone just as he was leaving the conference room, a message from Celia. She's perfect. You were right. Robert paused mid-step, thumb hovering over the screen. No context, no elaboration, just 6 words. He didn't need more. He ducked into his office, loosened his tie, and leaned against the edge of his desk, rereading the message. Something about it settled in his chest and stirred all at once. He'd hoped Daisy would connect with Celia, professionally, creatively. He'd seen her talent up close, watched how she transformed spaces with grace instead of flash. But Celia was particular, emotionally driven. If Daisy had impressed her that quickly, it meant something. Robert opened the message again and typed, "She's easy to believe in." Then he deleted it. Too personal. He replaced it with, "Glad to hear it. Keep me posted." He set the phone down, though his thoughts refused to follow. Since their meeting, Daisy had quietly occupied a strange part of his mind, not as a passing thought or a professional asset, but as something else, something steady. She didn't chase attention the way most people did in his world. She moved through it, quietly rearranging what she touched. He'd seen her hands when she gestured over her sketchbook. steady, intentional, a creator's hands. He admired that. But there was more to it, the way she listened, the way she saw people, and the way, for a few too short moments, her gaze had lingered on his, not with expectation, but with something closer to quiet understanding. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. Focus. There was work to be done, investors to meet, deals to close. His name carried weight for a reason, and he couldn't afford to be distracted, not even by someone who made distraction feel like clarity. Still, he reached for his phone again, scrolled through his photos until he found the one he'd taken at the gala, the one of her, caught in profile under the canopy of hanging blossoms she'd helped create. He hadn't meant to keep it, but he hadn't deleted it either. Just then, his assistant buzzed through the intercom. "Mr. Sage, your next appointment is waiting." Robert straightened his cuffs and glanced once more at the screen before locking it. "Send them in," he said, already moving toward the door. But even as the next client entered, something in him remained elsewhere, still thinking of her. The soft creak of the boutique's front door faded behind her as Daisy stepped inside, indigo design, her sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest. The familiar scent of lavender, roses, and eucalyptus clung to the air like a welcome, wrapping around her with quiet reassurance. But today, the calm wasn't quite enough to steady her nerves. She had exactly 1 week to prepare a full design proposal for Celia Sage's wedding, her first solo client project. No safety net, no creative director hovering nearby, just her. "You're not the girl on the corner anymore," she reminded herself as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've earned this seat at the table." She set up her workstation in the design room, rolled out the large sheet of drawing paper, and opened her sketch pad. The conservatory's natural architecture was already sketched in. Her job now was to make it bloom. Stillness settled over the space as she reached for her markers and pencils, arranging color swatches and texture samples beside her. As she drew, the plan began to unfold. A hand-woven aisle runner lined with pressed florals from the bride's childhood memories. Suspended arrangements that echoed the gentle symmetry of nature, not the rigid overdone styles that screamed budget excess. Blush-toned roses softened by ivory lisianthus and pops of wild jasmine, delicate, emotional, intentional, just like Celia wanted. But no matter how hard Daisy focused, his voice kept drifting back into her thoughts. The way Robert had said, "I trust your instincts." So simple, so confident, and so rare, especially from someone in his position. She hadn't known what to expect from him. Men like Robert Sage didn't usually make room for people like her, but he had, and that unsettled her in ways she couldn't put words to. As the afternoon wore on, she paused only once, reaching into her satchel for her phone. A new message waited from Celia. "Robert said you're impressive. I already knew it. Can't wait to see what you create. Let me know if you want to stop by the venue again. Sunsets are magic out here." Daisy smiled, a flush blooming beneath her cheeks. It shouldn't have mattered that Robert said that. But it did. Because somewhere in the quiet of her own heart, she wasn't just designing a wedding. She was designing the life she'd always been afraid to believe she could have. One page, one bloom, one sketch at a time. The conference room was sleek, spotless, and stifling. Glass walls, high-gloss surfaces, the kind of place where power postured in $1,000 suits and tension wore cologne. Robert sat at the head of the table, every eye turned toward him. "Expansion is the obvious next move," said Curtis Lang, one of the board's more vocal voices. "We're sitting on capital. If we don't act now, someone else will." Robert said nothing. Not yet. He sifted through the report in front of him, data points blurring into one another. Profit margins, projected growth. Licensing models in Singapore. Every number meant something, and yet it all felt oddly distant today, like background noise to a different, quieter melody playing somewhere else in his mind. A flower girl with soil on her hands and sunlight in her eyes. A boutique design proposal drawn in soft pencil strokes and honest effort, and a quiet conviction in someone who didn't realize yet how rare she was. "Robert?" Curtis prompted, his tone tinged with challenge. "Are we aligned here?" Robert looked up slowly. "I'm aligned with what's sustainable. And expansion is sustainable. If it's thoughtful," Robert said, folding the report closed. "If it serves more than just the shareholders." Curtis scoffed. "We're not in business to be sentimental." No, Robert said, tone sharpening just enough to command the room again. We're in business to be better than the last version of ourselves, which sometimes means not just growing wider, but deeper. Silence. A few glances exchanged. A nod from the CFO. Someone tapped a pen. Robert leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled. We move forward, he continued, but not without clarity. No bloated launches, no rushing into shallow markets. I want the strategy team to run new projections, this time with long-view ethics in mind. I'll meet with them directly next week. The meeting adjourned shortly after, and the room filtered out. He stayed behind. Leaning on the back of his chair, Robert watched the city buzz outside the window. Traffic pulsed, people hurried, buildings glittered with ambition. And yet all he could think about was how Daisy had spoken at the meeting in his office. No script, no performance, just truth. How long had it been since someone in his world spoke without agenda? He tugged his tie loose, loosened his collar, and glanced down at his calendar. His assistant had scheduled a midday review of a potential venue vendor. Routine. Instead, he reached for his phone. Celia, can you send me photos of Daisy's early sketches? Just curious where she's heading with the design. He hovered a second, then hit send. Curious. That's what he told himself. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't just following a project. He was watching a story unfold, one that had somehow already taken root in the spaces between meetings, reports, and boardroom wars. And for the first time in a long time, Robert Sage wasn't just building futures for others. He was starting to imagine one for himself. The sunlight pouring through the tall windows of Indigo Design should have felt comforting, warm, uplifting. But today, it only reminded Daisy of how long she'd been sitting in the same chair, staring at the same blank portion of her sketch pad. Everything was in place, except the centerpiece. The heart of the ceremony design, the one feature meant to anchor the space and tell Celia's story, remained stubbornly undefined. No matter how she sketched or rearranged ideas, nothing clicked. Every idea felt too showy, too shallow, too far from what had made Celia's voice light up in the meeting. And the clock was ticking. Daisy leaned back, pressing her thumb and forefinger to her temple. Maybe I'm in over my head. She'd been so sure, so ready to take this on. But the pressure had crept in quietly, not from Celia, not even from the boutique, from herself, from the fear that this was her one real shot and she was already failing to measure up. A soft knock at the boutique's side entrance pulled her out of the spiral. Delivery, called one of the junior florists, and holding a small parcel in brown paper. Daisy blinked. For me? Yep, it says personal. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a simple black envelope, elegant and understated, her name handwritten on the front in a looping serif. She opened it. Heard you're in deep with the design. Thought this might help spark something. Tucked inside was a photo. Not just any photo, the conservatory at golden hour. The glass walls glowed with the soft, melting colors of sunset. Gold, blush, soft lavender, all blending into a perfect wash of light. Shadows stretched like ribbons across the marble floor. Daisy stared at it, breath caught somewhere between her ribs. The image alone would have been enough. But the fact that Robert had sent it, that he'd thought of her, of the project, of the quiet tension behind the scenes, made it feel like something more. It wasn't romantic. Not exactly. But it was intentional. And in its own way, it was more generous than any bouquet. Daisy turned back to her sketchpad, the edge of a smile tugging at her lips. She flipped to a fresh page, picked up her pencil, and slowly the centerpiece began to take shape, not as a towering floral spectacle, but as an arch of wild, cascading blooms designed to mirror the flow of the sunset itself. Airy, alive, honest, she thought. This is what the space wants to be. Maybe what she wanted to be too. Robert sat in his office, tapping the edge of his pen against the desk in a steady rhythm. It was late afternoon, and the city beyond his window was settling into a quiet lull, the kind that made everything feel more measured. The black envelope he'd sent to Daisy had been a small thing, almost impulsive. He hadn't planned it. He'd been flipping through his phone during a lunch break, scanning photos Celia had forwarded from the conservatory when one had stopped him mid-scroll. The sunset. There was something about the way the light had spilled through the glass walls, soft, unfiltered, unapologetically beautiful. It reminded him of the way Daisy looked when she was lost in thought, her brows drawn tight, but her eyes alive with quiet determination. Before he knew it, he'd sent it to one of his assistants with clear instructions. Deliver this to Daisy Bailey. No explanation necessary. Now, sitting in the aftermath of that moment, he couldn't quite shake the feeling he'd crossed an invisible line. Not a professional one. The gesture was harmless enough, but a personal one. Because the truth was, he'd wanted to see her reaction. Not just to the photo, but to the unspoken message it carried. I see what you're trying to build, and I believe in it. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message from Celia. Daisy called. She's found her centerpiece concept. You're gonna love this. A small smile tugged at his lips. He didn't need to know the details. Just knowing she'd moved forward was enough. Still, he couldn't help wondering what she'd created, what shape her vision had taken. Another buzz, this time a message from his assistant. Celia asked if you'd sit in on Daisy's proposal presentation tomorrow. She wants your input. Robert set the phone down, his pulse quickening slightly. Sit in on the presentation? He hadn't been planning to. It wasn't his role. Celia was more than capable of handling it. But the idea of seeing Daisy in her element, presenting her work with that quiet confidence he admired, was compelling. After a moment, he typed a response. Schedule it. I'll be there. As the evening stretched on, Robert tried to refocus on the pile of documents waiting for his signature. But every few minutes, his mind wandered back to the boutique, to the black envelope, and to a woman with soil-stained hands who somehow managed to rearrange his thoughts without even trying. The meeting room at Indigo Design wasn't large, but today it felt cavernous. Daisy stood at the front, hands gently resting on the easel that held her final presentation board. She'd triple-checked everything, the sketches, the floral palettes, the mock-ups. She was ready, or at least she thought she was, until Robert Sage walked into the room. He didn't make an entrance, just slipped in behind Celia, quiet and composed in a navy suit that somehow made the space around him feel smaller. Daisy's stomach flipped the way it had when she'd first seen her name typed on the company schedule beside his. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not for this part. But he was. And now her nerves had company. Go ahead, Daisy, Celia said with a smile, settling into her seat. We're excited to see what you've brought to life. Daisy nodded, inhaled deeply, and began. The theme is transformation through light and form, she said, lifting the first sketch, a wide angle of the conservatory space, into view. This design builds off the natural architecture. Instead of competing with it, I wanted the floral work to echo it, let the space breathe with the event. She flipped to the next sketch, an arch of loose, cascading florals in muted blush and dusky lavender. The ceremony centerpiece mimics the way light filters through the glass at sunset, soft, organic lines, a kind of choreography between light and petals. Celia leaned forward, eyes shining, but Daisy couldn't help glancing at Robert. He was watching her, not the sketches. Her, and not with critique, with interest, real, unguarded interest, the kind that made her pulse quicken. She pressed on, flipping to the reception layout, long tables draped in velvet, low arrangements dotted with waxflower, hellebore, and dried lunaria. It's not about extravagance, she said, like her voice growing steadier. It's about presence, the idea that beauty doesn't need to shout, it can speak in stillness. A beat of silence followed. Then Celia clapped softly. It's perfect, truly, Daisy. You captured exactly what I didn't know I wanted. Daisy exhaled. Relief spread through her chest. Then Robert spoke. Tell me about the photo, he said. Her gaze snapped to his. The one you sent? He nodded once. You didn't replicate it. You translated it. Daisy blinked. That was the hope. A faint smile ghosted across his face. You did more than hope. You understood it. Heat crept up her neck. She lowered her eyes to the table, suddenly aware of how visible everything felt. Celia broke the moment. Well, I think we've found our lead designer for this event. Daisy looked up, stunned. Lead? Celia grinned. You've earned it. Daisy's mouth opened, but no words came. Gratitude surged up behind her ribs, thick and bright and terrifying. As the meeting wound down, Robert stood last. He gave a small nod as he passed her. Congratulations, he said quietly. And Daisy? She looked up. Keep building like this. You don't need a title to own the room. Then he was gone, and Daisy was left with the feeling that something had just shifted. Inside her work, yes, but also inside her. Because when Robert Sage looked at her, it wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. And maybe, just maybe, something more. Robert didn't return to his office right away. Instead, he took the long route through the building's quieter west wing, past the tall windows where the sun spilled in like liquid gold, the very same light Daisy had captured so elegantly in her sketches. He didn't need to see the renderings again to remember them. They were still vivid in his mind. The arch of florals, the echo of sunset, the way she spoke of beauty not as spectacle, but as presence. She hadn't just understood the vision, she'd reshaped it. And that stirred something he wasn't sure he could name. It had been a long time since he'd felt this kind of pull towards someone, something deeper than intrigue, subtler than desire, a sense of being seen back, not as the CEO, not as the man with the jet black schedule and sharp suits, but as someone human, curious, capable of being affected. It unnerved him because Robert Sage didn't do complicated. He built, he scaled, he fixed what was broken. Feelings, especially those he couldn't quantify or forecast, weren't part of the equation. And yet, when she looked at him after the meeting, her eyes wide with a blend of disbelief and pride, he'd felt it. That quiet hum of electricity that warned a man he was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He stopped near the atrium wall and rested a hand in his pocket, glancing down at his phone. A calendar reminder pinged. Board meeting in 30 minutes. Right. He was supposed to be thinking about quarterly projections, expansion opportunities in Singapore, the incoming merger proposal. Instead, he was thinking about a woman with ink on her fingers and light in her voice. You don't need a title to own the room, he'd told her. What he hadn't said, couldn't say, was that she'd owned him, too, for those few minutes. Not in any official way, but in the way someone does when they create something so honest, it strips away your excuses. She wasn't asking for his attention, but she had it anyway. Robert exhaled slowly and started back toward the main hall. He could still draw a line between them, still keep the distance that professionalism demanded, but he was beginning to wonder, how long could that line hold if part of him wanted it to blur? The door of Indigo Design clicked shut behind her, but the echo of Robert's voice stayed with her. Keep building like this. You don't need a title to own the room. The words had settled in her chest like a slow-burning ember, warming, flickering, refusing to go out. Daisy walked down the cobblestone path outside the boutique, her tote bag tucked under her arm, a fine layer of pollen still dusting her hands. She could still smell peonies on her skin. She had walked into that meeting prepared to prove herself. She hadn't expected him to be there, and she certainly hadn't expected to feel seen. Not just for her work, but for the vision behind it, for the way she trusted the language of petals, texture, and light more than she trusted most people. She'd spent so much of her life being the one who stood behind the stall, arranging stems and coffee cans and hoping someone would stop and notice. That someone like him, Robert Sage, untouchable, unreadable, would be the one to stop? That had never entered the equation. Her phone buzzed. A message from Celia. Congrats again, lead designer. You absolutely nailed it. Let's chat this week about the full rollout. Daisy smiled, then tucked her phone away. The title meant something. Of course it did. It was a door that opened to new rooms, new clients, new trust. But deeper than that was the shift happening inside her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's shoes. She felt like she belonged. Like her instincts, sharpened by years of trial and error, by early mornings at the flower market, by careful listening, were enough. She rounded the corner to the cafe next door and ducked inside, ordering a lavender tea just to stay near the scent of blossoms a little longer. As she waited, she pulled out the envelope Robert had sent her. She hadn't thrown it away. Couldn't. The photo still took her breath away, not because of what it showed, but because of what it meant. He'd noticed, and then he'd chosen to share that noticing without fanfare, without an ask. Just a moment, a spark. She didn't know where it led. But something had changed after that meeting, not just between them, but within herself. She sipped her tea, fingers warming around the cup, and let the moment settle in. This wasn't the finish line. It was the start of something she hadn't dared hope for until now. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window of their tiny apartment, and catching in the folds of the lace curtain Grandma Agnes refused to part with. It was the same kind of light Daisy had tried to mimic in her design for Celia's wedding. Soft, golden, forgiving. Agnes sat in her usual spot, wrapped in a knitted shawl the color of faded cornflowers. Her breathing was slow but steady today, a small mercy Daisy never took for granted. "I saw that look in your eyes when you walked through the door," Agnes said without preamble. "Something happened." Daisy smiled faintly as she set her tote down and began unpacking a small bundle of market tulips she'd picked up on the way home. "It was the meeting, the big one I told you about." Agnes's brows lifted. "Did they like it?" "They did more than like it," Daisy said, arranging the stems into a mason jar. "Celia made me lead designer for her wedding." Agnes clapped her hands together, slow but proud. "My girl, I knew it." Daisy looked over, emotion catching her a little off guard. "It feels real now, Graham. Not just a dream I talk about over tea." Agnes watched her for a beat, then leaned back against the cushions. "And what about him?" Daisy blinked. "Who?" "Don't you play coy with me, Daisy Marie. The one you won't admit you think about more than you should. Mr. Big Presence in a suit." She laughed, half embarrassed. "Robert Sage wasn't supposed to be at the meeting, but he showed up, sat in the back like it was just another Tuesday. No warning. Just him." Agnes chuckled, the sound crackling like old paper. "And what did he think of your flowers?" "He said, I didn't copy his photo, that I translated it, that I didn't need a title to own the room." Agnes tilted her head. "He sees something in you." Daisy looked down at the tulips, adjusting them in the jar until they leaned just right. "Maybe, but it's Celia's wedding, not his. I need to stay focused." "You do," Agnes agreed, "but don't mistake focus for fear." That made Daisy pause. She looked at her grandmother, eyes rimmed with wisdom and time. "I don't know what this is, Graham, with him, or if it's anything at all." "You don't have to name it yet," Agnes said softly. "Just don't run from it. You've already lived a life full of almosts. This time, let something become." Daisy sank into the chair beside her and took Agnes's hand, squeezing it gently. She didn't know what would come next with Robert, but for once, she wasn't going to let the uncertainty shrink her. She had a wedding to design, a voice to trust, and just maybe, a heart beginning to hope again. Daisy stood in the floral studio, watching the soft sunlight play over the delicate petals of the lilies she'd ordered for Celia's wedding. The room was filled with the hum of activity, flowers arriving, arrangements being made, but Daisy's thoughts kept drifting. She couldn't shake the memory of Robert's words from their last meeting. They hadn't been anything overly personal, but they had been attentive. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd paid attention, like he was hearing more than just her designs. "Just keep building," he'd said. A small voice inside her asked if she had been building anything more than a career. Was there more to this, to the way he made her feel so seen? Her musings were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. She turned to find Celia entering, followed closely by Robert. Daisy's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected Robert to be here today, certainly not for this part of the process. It was supposed to be a simple discussion about timelines, colors, and themes. But as Robert stepped into the room, his sharp suit strikingly at odds with the softness of the floral designs, something in her chest twisted. He wasn't just here for business. He was here, and she was suddenly aware of how close he was to her world. "Daisy, we've got a few last details to go over for the wedding," Celia said, her voice full of cheer as she breezed past, handing Daisy a fresh list of tasks. "We need to lock in the centerpiece designs and some final touches for the reception space." Daisy nodded and gave her a warm smile before turning to Robert, who had crossed the room with surprising confidence. "Robert," she greeted, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed a hint of nerves. "Daisy," he replied with a quiet nod. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I thought you'd be finalizing arrangements elsewhere." "I thought so too," she said with a small laugh, trying to hide how awkward the situation felt now that he was standing so near. "But this is a huge part of the vision. I wanted to make sure everything feels right." "Everything looks right," Robert said, his gaze sweeping over the designs, each one carefully composed and vibrant. "I can see why Celia trusts you." There it was again, the way he seemed to see her. It made her heart do a strange flip, but she couldn't dwell on it. Not now. Celia joined them at the table, spreading out the floor plan for the reception. "So, here's the main space for the ceremony," she said, pointing to a diagram on the page. "I'm thinking about a minimalist layout, but we need something striking to complement the flowers." Daisy studied the layout, mentally visualizing how her designs would fit into the space. She'd already proposed a few ideas, but this required a careful balance. "Maybe we can create a contrast," Daisy said, turning back to Robert. "Something a bit more sculptural. Maybe an oversized floral installation, something to frame the space." Robert's brow furrowed as he studied the design. "That could work. It'll need to stand out without overpowering the natural lines of the room." Celia smiled brightly at Robert, but Daisy couldn't help but notice the way his attention never fully wavered from her. His focus was on the design. Yes, but there was an unspoken connection in the air between them, one that made her heartbeat uncomfortably loud. "We'll make sure it's striking," Daisy continued, pretending to stay in control, even though she could feel the weight of Robert's gaze. As they talked, the conversation flowed between ideas, compromises, and suggestions. Daisy's mind kept drifting back to the fact that Robert was here, not just as a businessman, but as someone invested in this process. She had the sense that for the first time, he wasn't just standing on the other side of a meeting table. He was right there with her. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Daisy allowed herself to wonder if that was enough to build on. The blueprint of Celia's wedding was spread out before them, dotted with swatches of fabric and a few stray petals that had fluttered loose from a nearby arrangement. Daisy knelt beside the low consultation table, holding a stem of wild orchid between her fingers, measuring its color against a silk ribbon Celia had picked out. Celia was in full bride mode now, comparing linens, pulling up mood boards, her phone pinging with responses from vendors and her stylist. Her voice animated the room, but Daisy noticed how Robert remained unusually quiet. He stood just behind Celia's shoulder, arms folded loosely, gaze flicking between Daisy's work and the printouts on the table. He wasn't just overseeing, he was present, attentive in a way that made Daisy hyper-aware of her every motion. Celia barely looked up as she said, "Robert, what do you think of the sweetheart table layout? Should we go with the arched floral frame or the hanging install above?" Robert stepped forward, scanning the options. They're both strong, but the hanging design leaves more open air in the space. It lets the guests focus on you two without the frame drawing their eyes away. Celia nodded thoughtfully. "That's true, Daisy?" "I agree," Daisy said, arranging the orchid next to the centerpiece sketch. "We can create something elegant with cascading florals and soft lighting, almost like the garden is leaning in to listen." Robert smiled faintly at that. Celia grinned. "You see why I hired her?" There was a pause. Daisy glanced up from the sketchpad and found Robert's gaze on her again, curious but gentler than she'd ever seen it. "You always speak in visuals," he said. "But it's more than that. You speak in feeling." Daisy blinked. "I guess that's just how I've always seen the world. It shows," he replied, and something unspoken passed between them. Celia, still distracted with her swatches that didn't seem to notice the shift in the air. "Okay," she said, straightening. "I need to take this call from the caterers. Be right back." She swept out of the room with her phone pressed to her ear, leaving the soft rustle of her departure behind. Suddenly, the studio was quieter, still. Daisy found herself alone with Robert in the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but expectant. "You didn't have to be here for this part of the process." "I know," Robert said, his voice low and even. "But I wanted to be." Their eyes met. "You're not what I expected," he added. "From the girl in the rain with the flowers to the woman leading this event, you keep surprising me." Daisy tried to smile, but her throat tightened. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, stepping a little closer. "You're building something, not just for Celia, for yourself." His words echoed Agnes's from just days ago, and it struck Daisy again, how somehow he always seemed to say what she hadn't dared admit aloud. "I didn't know I could," she said quietly, "until recently. You can. You are." He paused, then added, "And I'm not just talking about flowers." Daisy felt the air shift again. She could smell gardenia and eucalyptus and a thread of something more elusive, something like hope. Before she could speak, Celia's voice returned from the hallway. "Okay, the caterers are confirmed," Robert stepped back. The moment settled, unspoken but not forgotten. "Let's lock in the table arrangements next," Daisy said quickly, her voice returning to work mode. "We'll start with the head table and move outward." "Lead the way," Robert said, his expression unreadable, but something softer lingered at the edge of his mouth. As they bent back over the sketches, Daisy's hands moved with quiet confidence. Her heart was another matter entirely. But for now, it was enough to let the feelings bloom quietly, one petal at a time. He hadn't intended to stay. In truth, he'd shown up at Indigo that morning out of brotherly obligation. Celia had asked him to weigh in on a few final decisions for the wedding, and though he had a team of assistants more than capable of handling such things, she had asked him personally, and that mattered. But now, sitting in the quiet of his town car as it glided through the city streets, Robert found his thoughts lingering not on logistics, nor guest lists, nor vendors. They were with her. Daisy. There was something about the way she carried herself, not polished to perfection like the women who populated his world, but real, intentional. She moved with the grace of someone who didn't yet know how captivating she was. And yet, there was power in her gentleness. He hadn't missed how easily she had taken charge of the conversation when Celia stepped out. How her eyes had lit up when she described floral arrangements as if they were living poetry. That wasn't rehearsed. That wasn't charm. That was authenticity. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, a notification from a board member, something about the upcoming investors' dinner. He ignored it. He couldn't stop replaying the moment when he'd said, "You're building something, not just for Celia, for yourself." That wasn't the kind of thing he usually said to people. He was known for being measured, strategic, calculated in every move, both in business and in life. Words were tools, and he didn't use them lightly. But with Daisy, the words had felt instinctive, honest. He exhaled, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. Maybe it was dangerous, allowing this, whatever it was, to linger. She worked on a project tied to his family. There were expectations, lines, appearances. Still, the way she had looked at him just before Celia returned, he'd seen something there. Not flattery, not ambition, recognition. He ran a hand across his jaw, unsettled in a way he hadn't been in years. This wasn't a deal to close or a threat to neutralize. Daisy Bailey was a variable he hadn't planned for, and Robert Sage always planned. The car slowed to a stop outside the glass front of Sage Tower. "Mr. Sage?" his driver asked. Robert didn't respond right away. His mind was still wrapped around the lingering scent of eucalyptus and garden roses, the echo of Daisy's quiet voice as she said, "I didn't know I could." He'd known people with far more resources and far less courage. Finally, he stepped out of the car, expression once again composed. But as he passed through the lobby, a single thought followed him like the trailing scent of fresh blooms. She doesn't belong in my world. And yet somehow, it feels like she already lives there. The apartment was cloaked in a soft hush, the kind that arrived only after the city gave in to dusk and the last traces of daylight surrendered to the hum of street lamps. Daisy sat cross-legged on the worn rug beside Agnes's bed, a warm cup of chamomile in her hands, steam curling around her fingers like silk. Agnes had dozed off not long after dinner, her breathing calm, steady, a blessing Daisy never took for granted. The earlier days when worry clung to her like ivy felt a world away. Things were different now. Not perfect, but different. The air didn't feel quite so heavy. The future no longer seemed like something she had to brace herself against. And still her thoughts drifted to him, Robert Sage. The name alone should have felt distant, too lofty to sit comfortably in her mind. But it didn't. It nestled there, unshakable. She wasn't naive to the whispers that surrounded him, the boardroom brilliance, the cool control, the kind of man who didn't need to look twice. And yet he had. From that first day on the corner, her flowers, his brief glance, he had seen her. Not just noticed, seen. The memory tugged at her like an invisible thread. His quiet gestures, his timing, always careful, never too much. The way he had woven himself into the edges of her life, never demanding a place but never quite leaving either. And then there was Indigo. The boutique had become more than a job. It was a canvas, a test, a door she dared to walk through. Because of him, because he'd opened it, yes. But she was the one who'd kept walking. Daisy glanced around the apartment. A soft draft stirred the curtains. Agnes's bedside lamp flickered, casting golden rings across the room. Everything felt quiet, still, yet humming with something she couldn't name. "Something's changing," she whispered to herself. It wasn't just the way Robert had looked at her during Celia's last design session, or how his voice softened around her, how he leaned in as if her words held weight. It was the way she felt, like she was finally growing into the version of herself Agnes had always believed in. No longer just the flower girl on the corner, but Daisy Bailey, the woman who made beauty bloom under pressure. The one who could hold her own in a room filled with expectations, who had dreams now, not just needs. She reached over and smoothed the edge of Agnes's blanket, her heart full. "Gran," she whispered, barely audible, "I think I'm falling, and I'm not sure what scares me more. What comes next, or how much I want it to." The old woman stirred faintly in her sleep, murmuring something about petals and stars. Daisy smiled, her eyes shining in the dim light. She didn't have the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She set her cup down, pulled a blanket over her shoulders, and settled onto the couch. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, a quiet kind of hope had taken root, ready to bloom. The Sage Tower conference room had emptied out minutes ago, but Robert remained seated, unmoving. The sleek marble table in front of him gleamed under recessed lights, reflecting the untouched glass of water at his side and the folded report he hadn't bothered opening. Manhattan's skyline stretched behind him, bold and indifferent. He was used to this view, used to being above it all. But today, the distance between where he sat and what he felt was dizzying. "She's talented," Elliot Brandt had said just before leaving. "But let's be honest, Robert. If Indigo's little flower girl weren't tied to you, we wouldn't be talking about her handling another high-profile event." The words hadn't stung so much as needled. Elliot wasn't wrong. Daisy was tied to him. But not the way Elliot thought. Robert leaned back in his chair, jaw clenched. That wasn't the first time her name had been brought up in a boardroom, not as a woman, but as a point of interest, a variable in his otherwise calculated reputation. And the truth? It rattled him. Not because he was ashamed, but because it mattered. He had never intervened where he couldn't justify the return. That had always been the rule. But Daisy? She had rewritten that equation from the moment he saw her balancing a bouquet of peonies in the spring rain, smiling at a stranger as if the world wasn't cold and indifferent. She reminded him of something he hadn't realized he missed. Possibility. And that was the problem. He rose slowly and walked to the window, sliding his hands into the pockets of his tailored trousers. Below, the city pulsed forward, unaware of the man staring down at it, unaware that for all his power and precision, Robert Sage was standing at a crossroad he hadn't planned for. He could retreat, keep things professional, distant, let the lines hold. But the image of Daisy at the boutique the other day, fingers dusted with pollen, eyes glowing as she adjusted a simple yet perfect arrangement, kept flashing in his mind. She hadn't seen him watching. That made it worse. That made it real. Robert exhaled sharply, the sound swallowed by the hum of city lights. He wasn't a man who feared many things. But he feared this, how easy it had become to imagine a life where she was more than an admiration from afar. His phone buzzed, a message from Celia. "Final RSVP changes for the wedding. Can you look at the layout with me tomorrow? Bring Daisy if she's around." He didn't respond right away. His reflection in the glass looked tired, not worn out, just weighted. Maybe that was the cost of caring. He turned from the window and grabbed his coat, voice steady as he called for his driver. But something in his step had shifted, just slightly, enough to tip the scale. He was no longer pretending Daisy didn't matter. Now, he just had to figure out what to do with that truth. The call had come in just after 8. A last-minute change to the ceremony layout, something about the lighting, the angle of the sunset, and the bride's sudden insistence on swapping the flower arches for a suspended installation. Celia had been gracious but firm. "I'd feel better if you were there in person, Daisy." And so she was, portfolio in hand, nerves tucked behind a professional smile, as she stepped into the grand hall of the waterfront venue. It was stunning, of course. Every detail from the marble floors to the chandeliers dripped with curated luxury. But Daisy didn't let herself get distracted. She had a job to do, except she hadn't expected him to be there. Robert Sage stood near the tall, arched windows, his posture relaxed, hands clasped behind his back as he studied the empty aisle. The warm afternoon sun caught the edge of his jawline, casting just enough shadow to soften his otherwise unreadable expression. He turned when she approached, his gaze catching hers with a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise, but wasn't quite neutral either. "Daisy," he said simply, "I didn't expect them to call you in." "They didn't," she replied with a quiet smile. "Celia did." He nodded, stepping aside so she could join him at the window. They stood together for a moment in easy silence, the scent of lavender and wood polish lingering in the air. "She wants the arrangement suspended," Daisy said eventually. "We'll have to test the rigging, make sure the weight is evenly distributed. I've already made notes on the lighting adjustment." "Of course you have," Robert said, glancing at her. "You always come prepared." She flushed slightly, her fingers tightening around the folder in her hand. "Well, when the margin for error is microscopic and everything costs more than my apartment, preparation helps." That drew the faintest smile from him. Real. Warm. Their shoulders almost touched as they leaned over the planning binder laid across a nearby table. She pointed to a sketch, her handwriting looping softly around structural cues. "You drew this by hand?" he asked. Daisy nodded. "It helps me think." He met her eyes then. No amusement, no arrogance, just sincerity. "For what it's worth, I never asked them to go easy on you. You earned this." The words landed like warmth in her chest, unexpected and deeply wanted. She looked away, blinking. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment, everything else fell away, the elegant venue, the looming wedding, the soft press of time. It was just them, not CEO and florist, not the man who opened a door and the woman trying to prove she belonged, just Robert and Daisy. He looked like he might say something more, but a door creaked open at the back of the hall. Celia's voice rang out, followed by the shuffle of her heels on polished marble. "Ah, you're both here," she beamed. "Perfect. I had a new idea about the chairs. Let's talk symmetry." Daisy exhaled softly, stepping back into her role, back into motion. But as Robert followed her toward the bride, his hand brushed gently against hers, just enough to be accidental, just enough to make her heart skip. It was nothing, and it was everything. The ride home was a blur. Her reflection in the scratched window looked composed, shoulders back, chin lifted, but inside, her thoughts stirred like petals caught in a windstorm. She'd been careful, measured, professional. But Robert Sage had a way of slipping past her defenses, not with grand gestures, but with subtle acknowledgments. The quiet way he'd said she earned her place, the way he'd looked at her during Celia's final layout review, as though she wasn't a supplier of floral decor, but someone who mattered, someone he saw. And maybe that was the most dangerous part. When she finally stepped into the apartment, the familiar scent of chamomile and the soft murmur of Agnes humming to the radio greeted her. The comfort should have grounded her. Instead, she felt more adrift. Agnes glanced up from her chair by the window, her knitting needles momentarily still. "Long day, sweetheart?" Daisy offered a weary smile. "Productive, beautiful venue. High stress." "Ah," Agnes nodded knowingly. "And him?" Daisy blinked. "Robert?" Agnes gave her a look that cut through pretense like shears through satin. "You come home with that look on your face, the one that says you're thinking too hard for your own good. That's not about flowers, that's about him." Daisy laughed softly, easing onto the couch. "Gran, I don't even know what this is." "Then you're in it deeper than you think." She didn't argue, because somewhere between the shared sketches and the almost touch of his hand, something had shifted. Again. And she didn't know how to stop it. "But I do know what it's not." Daisy added quietly, turning her face to the ceiling. "It's not smart, it's not safe, and it's definitely not part of the plan." "You've never stuck to plans," Agnes said gently, the edge of mischief in her tone. "You follow your heart, and you make beauty out of broken stems." Daisy closed her eyes for a moment. "He helped me, Gran, got me in the door, and I know it wasn't charity, but it wasn't exactly neutral either. I feel like I'm still trying to catch up." "And does he make you feel small?" Agnes asked. "No," Daisy whispered, truth threading through her chest. "The opposite." "Then maybe," Agnes said, resuming her knitting, "you're not behind. Maybe you're just becoming." Daisy sat in the quiet that followed, her fingers brushing the fabric of her skirt as she stared into the soft shadows of the room. She didn't know if she was ready for what was happening, for what she was feeling. But she was starting to believe something fragile and frightening, that this story, the one she'd never dared to imagine for herself, might actually include her name and his. The city was quieter than usual. Manhattan's rhythm had dulled to a whisper, the kind that only came in the small hours of the night when the world exhaled and men like Robert Sage could finally think without interruption. He stood in his apartment, sleek, minimalist, every surface deliberate, and yet it all felt hollow tonight. He poured a glass of scotch and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline. His reflection stared back at him, composed, successful, untouchable. And yet, that wasn't the man Daisy Bailey saw. She saw something else. Someone else. Someone more human. The sound of her voice still echoed in his mind from earlier that day. Clear, steady, smart. She had answered Celia's questions with quiet confidence, adjusting her sketches with precision, showing the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught. And when their hands brushed, brief, accidental, it had startled him. Not just because of the contact, but because he had felt something immediate, undeniable. And now, he couldn't get her out of his mind. Not because of proximity, not because of gratitude, but because, in her presence, the carefully built walls of his life started to feel unnecessary. He thought about the way she'd looked at the design sketch, focused, fierce, as if she'd carved a space for herself in that room without asking permission. That was the difference. Daisy never once asked to be rescued, and that, ironically, made him want to protect her more. He took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the burn settle in his chest. This wasn't infatuation. It wasn't lust or admiration from a distance. This was a slow, steady gravity pulling him closer. Irresistible and quietly terrifying. Robert closed his eyes. He had a company to run. A reputation to uphold. Decisions to make that couldn't afford distractions. And yet, somewhere beneath all that, a voice whispered, "She's not a distraction. She's the reason you're finally paying attention." The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee. Daisy sat curled in a chair too small for comfort, her coat draped over her lap, fingers gently tracing the edge of a worn paperback she wasn't really reading. Agnes was resting upstairs. The nurses had assured her everything was stable, the latest treatment easing the tightness in her chest. It was a relief, a fragile, temporary kind, but Daisy clung to it with both hands. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. It had been a long day. Her mornings started at Indigo with a cascade of client emails, followed by a delivery mix-up in Midtown and a final emergency dash to the boutique to retrieve specialty orchids. She hadn't planned on ending her night here. The soft chime of the elevator pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up and froze. Robert. He stepped into the hallway, not in one of his pressed suits, but in a navy sweater and charcoal coat, the collar turned slightly against the cold. He looked like he didn't quite belong in the fluorescent-lit world of late-night hospitals, and yet, there he was. Her heart stammered. "I heard Agnes was admitted," he said quietly, crossing the room in slow, unhurried steps. "I called ahead. The nurse said you were still here." She rose instinctively. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he replied, voice low and sure. "I wanted to." For a moment, the air between them shimmered with unsaid things. Gratitude, tension, maybe even fear. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the patient rooms. "How is she?" "Resting," Daisy said. "They're adjusting the treatment. It's manageable, for now." Robert nodded, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" She unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the print. It was confirmation of full payment. Every outstanding medical bill cleared. Daisy's breath caught. "I can't, Robert. This is too much." "It's not," he said. "She's your anchor, and I know what it's like to love someone and feel powerless to help. Let me do this." She didn't respond right away, emotion crowding her chest. The page trembled slightly in her hands. "Don't feel like you owe me anything," he added, quieter now. "This isn't about strings or favors. It's about what's right." She met his gaze then, and something in her shifted. Not because he had done something generous, but because he had done it without expectation. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. He offered the faintest smile. "Then don't. Just go sit with her. That's where you're meant to be tonight." Daisy stood still for a long moment after he left. the paper still in her hands, heart still catching up to the moment. And when she finally sat back down, it wasn't just relief she felt, it was the fragile, blooming realization that she might not have to carry everything alone anymore. Not if she let him in. The boutique was quiet in the late afternoon, the scent of eucalyptus and garden roses lingering in the air like the memory of a whispered song. Daisy stood at her work table, delicately wiring pale ranunculus into a bridal bouquet. The motion soothed her, each twist of green tape calming the swirl of thoughts in her head. The hospital visit. Robert's kindness. The way he'd looked at her, not with pity but with something softer. Something that stayed with her long after he'd left. Daisy? Amara's voice floated in from the office. You have a delivery. Personal. Daisy blinked, brushing a curl from her cheek. A delivery? Amara gave a curious look but didn't press. She handed over a flat cream envelope sealed with a band of pale gold, the kind of paper that whispered elegance before it even revealed its contents. Daisy opened it carefully. Inside was a thick ivory invitation card, embossed with delicate florals. Her name, handwritten in deep ink, curled at the top like it belonged there. Miss Daisy Bailey, you are cordially invited to the rehearsal dinner of Celia Sage and Ethan Rhodes. Her eyes skimmed the rest of the elegant script, but her focus landed squarely on the host's signature at the bottom. The rehearsal dinner, not just the wedding installation. This not just business, a personal invitation, a breath caught in her throat. Someone has friends in very high places, Amara teased, leaning lightly on the doorway. Celia Sage? As in Sage Enterprises? Daisy nodded slowly, her cheeks warming. She's the bride, our client, and Robert's sister. Daisy stared at the invitation. Amara tilted her head. You going? Daisy hesitated. Part of her said no. This wasn't her world. Silk dresses and five-course meals, social circles where surnames carried weight. But another part whispered yes. Because this wasn't just about florals anymore. It was about being seen, being trusted, and maybe, just maybe, stepping into something new. Daisy traced her finger along the gold trim. The elegant letters of her name felt like a promise. She folded the invitation and tucked it into her bag. Yes, she murmured. I think I will. The rehearsal dinner sparkled, not just from the crystal chandeliers casting soft light across the ballroom, but from the care woven into every detail. Petals tucked into napkin folds, garlands suspended like poetry across the tables, and candlelight that flickered like stars catching their breath. It was Indigo Design's proudest installation yet. Daisy stood near the edge of the ballroom, hands still faintly dusted with floral powder, watching Celia Sage move through the crowd with grace. Laughter rose around her, champagne flutes clinked, and the strings of a live quartet threaded warmth through the air. Breathtaking. Daisy exhaled slowly. It had come together. Months ago, she was threading daisies into sidewalk bouquets. Now, she'd helped create this. She didn't notice Robert approach until his shadow joined hers. You disappeared, he said softly, standing just beside her. I needed air and a moment to take it all in, she replied, not turning just yet. Is it what you envisioned? She nodded. More. He glanced at her then, his expression unreadable but quieter than usual. You made it happen. We all did. He gave a small, appreciative smile. But your touch is all over this room. It feels like you. Daisy's breath caught at the way he said it, low, certain, like he wasn't talking about florals anymore. Thank you, for the chance, for all of it, she said, finally facing him. Robert hesitated, then gestured toward a side hallway lined with antique mirrors and marble sconces. Walk with me? She followed. The sound of celebration faded as they stepped into the quiet corridor. The distance wrapped around them like silk, close enough to hear the music, far enough for honesty. Robert stopped near a window where the city lights glimmered in the distance. He looked at her, really looked, and for a heartbeat, everything else slipped away. I didn't expect this, he said. Not just tonight. You. She searched his face. What did you expect? I thought I was helping someone find her footing, he admitted, but you already had it. You just needed space to stand. Daisy's heart beat louder. You believed in me before I knew how to believe in myself, she whispered. That matters more than you know. He took a step closer, slow, deliberate. There's a line I keep walking, Daisy, between what I can offer you and what I want to. She didn't back away. And what do you want? His voice dropped, barely a breath. More. For a moment, the city outside stilled. Inside that sliver of silence, their worlds tilted closer. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but his hand brushed hers, fingers curling gently like a question. And her answer, silent but sure, was in the way she didn't pull away. In that quiet corner of a glittering night, they stood there, uncertain and entirely seen. Daisy barely slept. The night before the wedding danced through her mind in looping fragments, Robert's hand brushing hers, his voice low and uncertain, the gentle ache of possibility blooming where fear used to sit. She'd replayed every word, every glance, as the city outside faded from night to morning. Now the day had arrived. The venue was transformed. An open-air conservatory washed in pale golds and soft blush, archways of hydrangea and cream peonies, ivory roses tumbling down staircases like something out of a dream. Each arrangement had been placed with precision, intention, and just a whisper of poetry. Daisy stood back and let herself feel it. Every detail whispered her touch. Every guest who paused to admire the floral displays was unknowingly walking through a piece of her heart. Celia Sage was radiant. Her laughter echoed like wind chimes, her train trailing behind her like the softest sigh of silk. Ethan's eyes hadn't left her once. And Robert, he moved through the crowd like someone carrying both legacy and love. Assured, charming, yet not unreachable. Not anymore. The ceremony passed in a shimmer of vows and violin, the sun setting just as the couple kissed. At the reception, the room pulsed with warm light and contentment. Champagne flowed. Laughter curled like ribbons through the crowd. And then Robert stood to give his toast. He held the microphone lightly, as though it might break with too much weight. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "To my sister Celia," he began, "and to Ethan, who clearly knows how lucky he is." The room laughed gently. "I've always admired Celia's strength. She leads with her heart, bravely, stubbornly, beautifully. And somehow she's found someone who doesn't just admire that strength, but protects it." He paused, eyes scanning the room, then landing unmistakably on Daisy. "Love isn't always a lightning strike," he said, more softly now. "Sometimes it's a slow, unexpected shift, a change in the air, a glance you weren't prepared for. And suddenly, you're standing in a room you've seen 100 times, but it feels different, because they're in it." Daisy felt her breath catch. "To Celia and Ethan," he finished, lifting his glass. "And to every kind of love, especially the kind that finds us when we least expect it." Glasses clinked, applause rose, but Daisy barely heard it. Later, after the music swelled and guests spilled into laughter and dance, she found herself outside, just past the conservatory in a quiet garden lit with soft lanterns. Footsteps approached. She didn't need to look. "I meant every word," Robert said, voice threading through the hush. "I know," she replied, turning to face him. He looked at her like she was the only thing in focus. "I've tried to keep this professional clean, but every day I see you, Daisy, I'm reminded that real beauty doesn't demand attention. It just changes the room." Her heart beat loud in her ears. "I'm not asking for everything all at once," he added, "but I am asking, if there's space in your life, for more." She smiled, eyes shimmering. "I think there already is." No hesitations, no questions, just the answer that had been waiting between them all along. The hush between them wasn't empty. It pulsed, alive with everything they hadn't said. Robert stepped closer. Not the poised CEO now, not the man who stood behind glass towers and iron confidence. Just him, unarmored. "I tried to stay out of your way," he said quietly. "Told myself I was doing the right thing, being distant, being fair, but it stopped feeling noble the moment I started missing you when you weren't near." Daisy's throat tightened. "You gave me a chance," she whispered. "But it became more than that. You didn't just open a door for me. You saw me, and no one ever really has." He reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, warm against her cheek. "I've watched you grow into rooms that were never built to hold your light," he said, "and every time you do, it humbles me." Her eyes met his. "You scare me, Robert." "I know," he said. "You scare me too." She laughed, softly, the sound catching in the moment like a bell before a storm. "But I don't want to be afraid of this anymore," she added. "Of us." He exhaled, and the weight between them seemed to fall away like something they'd both been carrying alone. "Let's see where this leads, not as CEO and florist. Just Robert and Daisy." "Robert and Daisy," she echoed, testing the shape of it aloud. He leaned in, not rushed, not unsure, and when their lips met, it wasn't fire or thunder, it was warmth. Steady, real, the kind of kiss that didn't ask questions because it already knew the answers. When they parted, her head still rested lightly against his chest, the scent of gardenias lingering in the air. Somewhere behind them, the reception carried on. Music swelled, laughter bloomed, but here in the quiet, everything had shifted. No more veils, no more guarded silences, just truth, and something very much like love, finally given room to breathe. Dawn broke gently over the city, spilling soft gold across Daisy's apartment. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the night's quiet moments like a melody she couldn't let go of. Robert's words, his touch, the way he had looked at her as if she were the only thing in focus. It all felt surreal. Yet it wasn't a dream. The world felt different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing colors she hadn't noticed before. She sat up, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. Her apartment, modest but warm, seemed to hold its breath with her. The faint hum of morning traffic outside reminded her that life moved on, but for her, everything had paused. Daisy glanced at the bouquet on her kitchen table, a simple arrangement she'd made for herself earlier in the week. The roses and eucalyptus seemed to echo Robert's toast, his quiet vow to something unexpected, something real. As she prepared her morning tea, her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Robert. "Good morning. Can I see you later today? No business. Just us." Her heart fluttered. She stared at the screen for a moment before typing her response. "Yes." Robert sat in his office, the early light casting long shadows across his desk. His usual routine of diving straight into work felt foreign. Instead, his thoughts lingered on Daisy, the way her smile softened her face, the way she didn't shy away from his honesty last night. He couldn't recall the last time he'd been this distracted, and for once, he didn't care. Picking up his phone, he scrolled through messages about Celia's wedding, a blur of thank yous and accolades for how perfect the evening had been. But it wasn't the event that mattered. It was the moment after in the garden with Daisy, where everything had shifted. He leaned back in his chair, his mind settling on a single thought. A knock at his office door pulled him back to the present. His assistant peeked in, her usual crisp demeanor softened. "Good morning, Mr. Sage. Celia wanted me to remind you about brunch later with the family." "Thanks, Linda," he replied. "I'll be there. Family." He smiled faintly. Celia had found her happiness, her forever. Maybe it was time he stopped standing on the sidelines of his own life and reached for something real, too. By mid-afternoon, Daisy found herself at a small cafe near the park, her hands curled around a warm cup of coffee. The hum of the city faded in the background as she waited. She spotted Robert approaching, his usual polished air tempered with something softer. When he sat across from her, there was no awkwardness, no walls, just them. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet," he admitted. "I wasn't sure either," she said, her smile teasing. "But here I am." "Here you are," he echoed, his eyes lingering on her as if committing the moment to memory. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daisy felt completely seen, not as someone struggling to find her place, but as someone worth standing beside. As their conversation unfolded, laughter mingling with shared stories, it became clear. This wasn't just a beginning. It was the start of something they'd both been waiting for, without knowing it. And the morning light, it felt like the first of many.